When Christopher Columbus first set foot in the New World, a new era of geographic discovery began. Yet, in its shadow, the seeds of an unprecedented nightmare were sown. The celebrated hero who discovered the Americas would one day be exposed. What terrifying truths lay hidden behind the gleaming image of a man history has long revered? Christopher Columbus was born in Genoa, Italy, but in 1476 he moved to Portugal, where he began joining ambitious maritime expeditions. In the 15th century, European trade was booming, and the hunger to expand markets drove the search for new routes to the east. Columbus proposed a daring voyage, sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean to reach Asia. After multiple rejections, he turned to the Spanish crown for support. At last, Queen Isabella I agreed to finance this one-of-a-kind expedition. On the morning of August 3, 1492, Columbus set sail from the port of Palos, commanding 3 ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina, accompanied by a crew of 88 men. They first caught the eastern winds southward toward the Canary Islands. After resupplying, the fleet shifted course westward on September 6. With favorable weather, they swiftly passed through regions that had never been charted. In the first 10 days alone, the expedition covered over 1,100 miles. But by September 19, unease began to spread. Despite repeated attempts to measure depth, the ocean floor remained unseen. Then, on October 7, a flock of migrating birds suddenly appeared, a sign brimming with promise. Columbus altered course to follow their flight path. Even so, doubt was growing in the hearts of some sailors. Under mounting pressure, the ship captains agreed, if no land was sighted within 3 days, they would turn back. Yet nature soon revealed its clues. Fresh tree branches drifting on the water hinted that land was near. At around 2 a.m. on October 12, a sailor aboard the Pinta spotted a pale glimmer on the horizon. This time, there was no mistake. Land had truly emerged. At sunrise, the ships drew close to the island, marking the dramatic end of their Atlantic crossing. By midday on October 12, Columbus's crew had become the first Spaniards to set foot on this new land. He named the island San Salvador, convinced he was the first to discover it, largely because the inhabitants were almost entirely unclothed. As they approached, it was clear these were neither Chinese nor Indian people. Today, we know very little about the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean at that time. First, they had no writing system, leaving no records behind. Second, their oral traditions were entirely erased under Spanish colonial rule. As a result, all our knowledge of these tribes comes from the first Europeans who encountered them. Relying solely on second-hand accounts has deeply distorted our understanding of their cultures. One of the most enduring mistakes in the history of the New World's discovery was Columbus's decision to call the native peoples Indians. When he first landed on the Caribbean islands, Columbus believed he was near the eastern shores of India. This error in naming was quickly adopted by the Spanish colonists and, over time, became the common term for centuries. The consequence: hundreds of distinct nations across the Americas were all forced under a single, inaccurate name. But the story didn't end there. At first, Columbus appeared grateful for the warmth and generosity of the native people on the island of San Salvador. Yet, hidden behind this outward appreciation, a colder thought began to surface in his journal. Columbus believed these islanders could become the perfect servants. They were obedient, quick to learn, and, in his view, unbound by any clear religious system. He even wrote that, with God's permission, the expedition would take some of them back to Europe to learn to communicate through simple signs. After the Taino community told him there were countless islands further west, Columbus ordered the anchors raised, taking 6 captives with him to serve as guides. In the days that followed, the expedition reached new lands rich with life. Strange climbing vines, tall stalks of maize, and sweet potatoes growing in abundance in the West Indies soil. On October 28, he dropped anchor off the coast of Cuba, his hopes soaring. A small party was sent deep inland in search of signs of Chinese or Japanese civilization, but they returned empty-handed. The only thing they brought back was news of a strange custom: locals burning dried leaves and inhaling the drifting smoke, their faces calm and content. This was the first time Europeans had ever witnessed the use of tobacco. Meanwhile, rumors of gold spread rapidly through conversations with the islanders. Columbus was told of a place called B, where the glittering metal could be found along the shore, gleaming under the sun. Captivated by the tale, Captain Martin Pinzon of the Pinta quietly broke away from the fleet with his crew to begin his own treasure hunt. Columbus pressed on with the 2 remaining ships. On December 8, he arrived at another lush, green island, so reminiscent of his peaceful homeland that it left him awestruck. He named it Hispaniola. As with so many other communities before, the locals welcomed the explorers with open arms and genuine hospitality. In his journal, Columbus noted that the local chief wore lavish gold ornaments and was surrounded by others dressed in ornate attire. More importantly to him, the people were timid, compliant, and could be made to work as ordered. It was now clear, Columbus's ambition had shifted from finding a route to the east to conquering and ruling this new land. On December 22, he received an invitation from Wanagari, a powerful chief in northwest Hispaniola. The invitation came with a finely crafted gold belt, making it hard to refuse. But on the way there, disaster struck. Exhausted after a night of feasting, the crew let down their guard, and the Santa Maria ran aground on a coral reef during Christmas Eve. Thanks to Wanagari and his villagers, most of the crew and cargo were saved. But Columbus was left with only the small Nina, far too small to carry everyone back to Spain. This gave him the perfect excuse to put a long-held plan into motion: establish a permanent settlement. Columbus ordered the Santa Maria dismantled, using its timbers to build a small fort on a sandy hill in northwest Hispaniola. 39 men were chosen to remain there, representing the Spanish crown. There was no longer any doubt. Columbus now viewed the native people as resources to exploit, with the ultimate aim of turning them into slaves. On January 4, 1493, Columbus set out on the first leg of his return voyage aboard the Nina. 2 days later, he encountered the Pinta, and the news Pinzon brought was enough for Columbus to overlook his desertion. They had ventured deep into Hispaniola's interior and discovered an unexpectedly large amount of gold. Yet the joy was short-lived. A brief clash with the Taino at Samama Bay quickly escalated into a bloody skirmish. Not wishing to take further risks, Columbus ordered the fleet to turn for home, bringing along native prisoners as living proof for the Spanish crown. But the journey back was brutal. The 2 ships were battered by violent storms, nearly sinking in the raging Atlantic. At one point, Columbus even lost track of Pinzon and the Pinta altogether. Many believed they had vanished forever. But on February 18, 1493, the Nina finally dropped anchor safely in the Azores. Columbus's troubles, however, were far from over. Strong headwinds forced him to stop in Lisbon instead of reaching his intended Spanish port. There, he waited anxiously for the reaction of the Portuguese crown, Spain's direct maritime rival. When informed, King João II reportedly muttered in quiet regret. Why had such a priceless opportunity slipped through his grasp? After several days, Columbus was allowed to continue his journey home. On March 15, around midday, the Nina sailed into Palos Harbor, ending a 224-day voyage. It was there that Columbus received startling news. Martin Pinzon had returned to Spain ahead of him, but was now dying from a severe illness. Fate spared Columbus's former companion from revealing the full truth about what had occurred in the New World. Around March 20th, Columbus, dressed in strange attire and carrying exotic items, including gold, entered the royal court with his entourage. He was welcomed as a hero returning from an unknown world. Granted the title Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Columbus was expected to swiftly unlock vast treasures from the lands he had found. Yet, from the perspective of investors, the expedition was a bitter disappointment. The promised grand civilizations of the East had turned out to be little more than illusion. What Columbus had actually brought back were a few tropical islands, some unusual plants, and accounts of friendly, peaceful natives. More than that, he had concealed crucial details in his reports, especially the loss of his flagship, the Santa Maria. Still, he proved persuasive, crafting letters in 1493 that stirred confidence and secured funding for another voyage. The Spanish crown wasted no time approving his plan. This time, the expedition would be far greater in scale, with a clear mission: to establish an official Spanish colony in the New World. In September 1493, a fleet of 17 ships and 1,200 men departed Cadiz. Among them were priests to spread Christianity, and soldiers prepared to use force when necessary. On the way, they charted several new islands, including Guadeloupe and Puerto Rico. But when Columbus returned to the fort in northwest Hispaniola, he found only smoldering ruins. Every Spanish soldier stationed there had been killed, the result of fierce conflict between the Spaniards and the Taino over gold, and over local women. Faced with this disaster, Columbus chose not to rebuild the old fort. Instead, he founded a new settlement on the island's northern coast, calling it Isabela. From there, he set out once more to claim additional territory. But from this point on, his true nature began to emerge. The journey was marked by repeated violent clashes with the native peoples. Several Carib tribes were accused of cannibalism, charges with no solid proof, and likely a convenient justification for Spanish massacres. Columbus continued to explore Cuba's coastline, but found nothing of note. Still, determined to convince the crown he was near the Asian mainland, he forced his crew to swear that this land was indeed the long-sought continent. Anyone who broke this oath would be punished by having their tongue cut out. Returning to Isabela in June 1494, Columbus found his dream colony collapsing. Diego, his son, left in charge, was powerless against the crisis. Most settlers were disillusioned, worn down by the harsh environment and by Columbus's authoritarian rule. Whispers of discontent crossed the seas in secret, carried in letters of accusation to the Spanish crown. The insatiable greed of the expedition soon drove them into direct conflict with the people of Hispaniola. But every attempt by the Taino to resist was crushed mercilessly. Columbus and his men unleashed ferocious war dogs and towering warhorses against them. His initial, somewhat conciliatory stance toward the natives quickly changed. Disappointed by the meager amounts of gold found, Columbus shifted to a far darker plan, turning the indigenous people into human cargo for profit. Around 1,500 were captured. Nearly a third were forced aboard ships bound for Spain. Most would never survive the brutal Atlantic crossing. The Spanish crown soon realized this slave trade was not only morally indefensible but also far less profitable than hoped. They decreed an end to all future shipments of native slaves. Yet for those who remained, fate was hardly kinder. After allowing soldiers to take whatever captives they wanted, Columbus released the rest, condemning them to fend for themselves in utter desperation. Many Taino women, in their panic, abandoned their own children as they fled. Unable to meet crushing gold tribute demands, and facing punishments of mutilation or execution, the survivors hid deep in the mountains, choosing to starve or be hunted like animals. Across the Antilles, the destruction and extermination continued, until there was no one left. According to research by the Oklahoma Medical Research Foundation, Hispaniola's population in 1492 is estimated at around 250,000. By 1517, that number had fallen to just 14,000. Some scholars believe the arrival of European and African settlers to the New World may have wiped out as much as 90% of the native population. The scale of devastation surpassed even the Black Death that once ravaged Europe. The arrival of the Spanish in the Caribbean unleashed a humanitarian catastrophe unlike anything the world had seen. The first cause was epidemic disease. Europeans brought deadly pathogens, measles, smallpox, against which the native peoples had no defenses. Their fragile immune systems meant entire communities were erased within only a few short years. The loss of so many in their reproductive prime crippled the ability to sustain future generations. The second cause was even more sinister, political and deliberate. From the earliest days of conquest, Spanish policy aimed to transform the natives into a coerced labor force. Columbus himself took the lead, organizing raids to capture and ship natives to Europe. In March 1496, he returned home after this deeply controversial voyage. But the welcome was nothing like the celebrations of 3 years earlier. Despite his polished words of self-defense, more and more began to doubt the truth of his earlier claims. It was now undeniable, Columbus had never reached India or China. The new lands he had found contained no golden cities, no towering empires as he had promised. Those who survived the epidemics showed little interest in Christianity. The Spanish monarch's faith in him began to waver. Still, the king maintained reluctant support, largely to prevent foreign powers from seizing whatever remained. In May 1498, Columbus was granted permission to embark on his third voyage. The funding came largely from selling Taino slaves he had previously brought to Spain. Though not recognized as such at the time, this may have been the most important journey of his career. He not only discovered the island of Trinidad but also became the first European to set foot on the South American mainland. On August 1, 1498, Columbus reached the coast of Venezuela and set foot on the mainland. This time, the opposition he faced did not come from people, but from dense troops of fierce, wild monkeys. At first, the explorer thought he had simply discovered another remote island. But as he traveled along the coastline, differences began to emerge. He came upon the mouth of the Orinoco River, a vast expanse of fresh water so great that Columbus believed only a massive continent could produce it. Still, the true nature of this land remained an unsolved mystery in his mind. He may have clung to the belief that he was in Asia, but the evidence suggested he was starting to suspect that his crew had stepped onto an entirely unrecorded part of the world. In a letter to the King of Spain, he wrote that His Majesty's subjects would one day possess these boundless lands, an entirely different world. Unfortunately, by then, Columbus's health was failing, weakened by a prolonged bout of dysentery from his previous voyage. Many modern scholars believe the illness had taken a toll on his mental state. Perhaps as a result, Columbus drifted deeper into fantasies that blurred the line between reality and myth. He speculated that this new land concealed treasures of legend, powers that could rule all mankind and guide souls to eternal paradise. Some even imagined it to be the biblical Garden of Eden itself, the origin point of humanity. Such lofty visions only deepened the Spanish crown's doubts about the man they once trusted. Suspicion grew rapidly when Columbus returned to Isabella. The settlement was in constant turmoil, with open rebellions against his and his son's authority. Unable to restore order, Columbus was forced to write to Spain, pleading for reinforcements, a request that became the perfect excuse for the Madrid court to act. Nobleman Francisco de Bobadilla was dispatched to investigate, suppress the uprisings, and bring charges if necessary. But Columbus's arrogance in receiving the royal envoy only made matters worse. Soon, he was arrested under serious accusations, including concealing wealth and plotting to make the island a private domain for his Genoese family. The result was chains around his wrists and the humiliation of being escorted back to Spain in disgrace. In May 1502, Columbus was granted permission for one final voyage, but under strict conditions. He was never again to set foot on Hispaniola. This time, his main objective was to explore north of the territories he had already visited. He still clung to the hope of finding a mysterious water passage leading directly to the fabled East. On this fateful journey, the expedition reached the Isthmus of Panama, just 20 kilometers from the Pacific Ocean. Beyond that moment, the voyage descended into a chain of hardships, despair, and escalating conflict. From native inhabitants to the wildlife itself, nothing escaped the harsh rule of the newcomers from the west. But disease, natural disasters, and endless, fruitless exploration slowly drained away all remaining hope. In November 1504, Columbus returned to Spain, physically worn down and mentally exhausted. From the moment he set foot on land, the last glimmer of restoring his honor was gone. Queen Isabella I, his most loyal patron in the face of doubt, had passed away. Trapped in despair, Columbus continued to insist to the royal court that every step of his path had been guided by the hand of God. He proudly declared that he had expanded the sacred domain of the church far beyond anything the crown itself had achieved. And he boasted of discovering more than 1,700 islands, excluding Hispaniola, describing them as larger in total area than all of Spain combined. Such grand claims were born of restless pride and an unshakable conviction that no one could take from him. The Spanish crown answered only with silence. Though his final years were not as destitute as some accounts claim, they were marked by disappointment and isolation. Today, historians view Columbus with deep ambivalence, shaped by two central truths. First, the immense and tragic impact his voyages had on the indigenous peoples of the Americas, especially in the Caribbean, where cultural destruction and human catastrophe came swiftly. Second, from a maritime perspective, he was the first European to establish clear, sustained contact with the continents across the Atlantic in the 15th century. On May 20, 1506, Christopher Columbus died quietly in Valladolid, ending the life of one of history's most controversial explorers, a man whose journeys forever altered the course of the world.